Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. I'm your host, Megan Lee, and this week we've got a little schedule switch up. I had originally planned for us to have an episode with my dietitian and friend Nicole talking about thyroid wellness, finding resilience through a holistic approach, and that will just be happening later on in the season. But don't you worry, my friend, I've got an excellent episode in store for us today. It's actually an interview I've been looking forward to all season because we are diving into the fascinating world of religious belief with philosopher and cognitive scientist Neil Van Leeuwen. With a PhD from Princeton University, Neil's expertise lies at the crossroads of religion, cognition, and culture. We're discussing his latest book, Religion as Make-Believe, where he challenges traditional views of faith, exploring how religious beliefs function more like imaginative stories than factual truths. Get ready for an eye-opening conversation about how belief shapes identity, influences behavior, and the surprising ways it impacts our modern lives. So without any further ado, let's kick it off. Hey, everybody. I am here with Neil Van Leeuwen, and I'm sure all of you know that this is such an exciting day for me. And Neil, will you just kick it off and introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background before we kick into your book, Religion as Make-Believe?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, first of all. I'm Neil Van Leeuwen. Currently, I'm at Georgia State University. I'm going to be moving to Florida State University, Department of Philosophy in the fall. Maybe more relevant for this, though, I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. My dad's ordained, and both my parents taught at Calvin College, so small Christian liberal arts college. And I've been doing research philosophically and also psychologically, collaborating with empirical researchers on the nature of belief and imagination for quite some time now. And about a decade ago, I decided to start applying my work to what I had observed growing up, religious belief, right? And it hit me one day, many years ago already, that it sure seems like a lot of religious belief is a form of imagining, or kind of like the imagining that guides make-believe play. But that's not mere imagining, because it constitutes people's group identities and it labels things in the world as being objects of sacred value, right? So it's like this sacred valuing, identity defining game of make-believe play. So that's kind of like where I came from and where I got to with this project. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about it and see what your questions are and what your audience is going to be interested in talking about.
Yeah, I know a lot of them are. Season one, I was a Reformed Christian. And then in March, I deconstructed, and now I'm an agnostic atheist. So who's listening? I'm not sure. But the audience got dramatically smaller. And so if any of my old friends are listening, then isn't that cool that they're open-minded to be here? And you have presented your information to religious folks. And even though the title might seem a little bit, whatever, they've received your information well, right? You mentioned that in the book.
Yeah. So I have my family is still religious, and I'll put it this way, a lot of kind of secular intellectual academic types, they predict that religious people are going to be really sort of offended by and upset by what I'm saying. And so far that hasn't been my experience, right? There's been a sort of maybe an uneasy interest in what I'm saying. And I think maybe part of that, if I can flatter myself a little bit, is maybe that I'm onto something that they're probably at some level introspectively aware of. Maybe they feel explicitly like they're playing make-believe a lot of the time, right? And there's some good anthropological research to back that up. So I've gotten kind of uneasy interest from religious folks themselves, and probably a lot of maybe the most enthusiastic reception, judging from my emails, are people who have deconstructed or left their religious traditions. And it's been really gratifying to hear people say, well, this sounds like what I was looking at.
Yeah, it's really probably one of, I think, the coolest books I've read in a long time. And I'll probably reread it, in 6 months, and I'll take it a totally different way, which is my favorite part about books. So let's dive right in. So one of the main things you challenge traditional views on religious belief by liking it to make believe, as you were just saying. And one of my favorite things is you were making the distinction between religious credences and factual beliefs. highlighting how factual beliefs are open to updating based on evidence. And as someone who studies science and nutrition and biochemistry, that is so important. Nutrition is always evolving and updating. And if we didn't do that, bad news bears, right? And I really, really resonated so much with that. And so whereas religious credences often resist such updates, could you elaborate on that concept?
Yeah. So the general idea is the human mind is capable of a lot of different ways of relating to ideas, ways of having what we call in philosophy and a lot of parts of psychology, cognitive attitudes, right? And relating one way is not the same as relating another way. And the word belief in philosophy and psychology, it tends to run two very different things together, right? So, someone believes that Jesus rose from the dead. Someone believes that their fridge has milk in it. A lot of philosophers have tacitly and sometimes explicitly tended to assume, oh, that's the same kind of thing. Oh, we call it by the same word, believe, right? Must be the same sort of thing. And so you get this picture of religious belief as if people straightforwardly think that, there's a talking snake in the Garden of Eden, just the same way they straightforwardly think that there are snakes in Madagascar or something like that, right? It's just like, oh, that's what things are like. That's what things are like. And this, in light of my work on imagining, this started to seem wrong to me. And one of the main differences in attitude type is just revisability in light of evidence. And it's not just science, by the way, it's also common sense, right? If you have a factual belief that the supermarket is open till 9 and then you see online that it's closing at 8, poof, your factual belief goes away, right? And so this is something I'm always reminding people of, that your everyday beliefs about the world, they update so quickly and in light of evidence and in a rational way that you kind of don't notice it happening. And against that background, it's all the more striking that religious credences, which can be about anything, by the way. So I'm not defining these attitudes in terms of their specific contents, but as a different way of relating to idea. And religious credences don't have this sort of compulsory tendency to update in light of evidence, right? So you can rub a religious credence's nose in contrary evidence, and it might stay put in a person's mind. And so the question is why? Why would it stay put? And I think the answer to that does have to do with the role that religious credences play in constituting someone's group identity. Because guess what, Megan? You wouldn't be a very loyal Christian if you would update your Christian beliefs just because the evidence was contrary. Okay? So if a religious credence is a marker of group identity, it doesn't do its job well if it revises in light of evidence. So it has to be a different attitude type or a different way of relating to ideas. And just to kind of bring it full circle, what else doesn't revise automatically or compulsorily in light of evidence? Well, your imaginings, right? If you want to imagine your Lady Macbeth because you're playing a show, that's going to guide your behavior in the context of the show. And all the evidence in the world contrary, right? You've got lots of evidence you're not Lady Macbeth. But guess what? You can continue to imagine that you are. And so the suggestion is that religious credences, not just in this respect, but in a lot of other respects, have what philosophers would call the functional profile of imagining. But it'd be wrong to say mere imagining because of the social and group identity roles that it plays.
Yeah. And you break this down so well in a very methodical way in your book. And I really appreciated that and how it builds on your theory and you make it really clear where you're going. And it was very easy to follow, which I appreciated so much because it is a complex topic and you're weaving so many things into it. And
it's hard to do. I had to work really hard.
I bet you did. Like as a writer, as a blogger, as a researcher, not on your level, but I can I was insanely intrigued and so stoked that you're willing to chat more about some of these concepts because we all see it loud and clear. I mean, before I was converted into high control religion, I believed also wild stuff. I mean, I thought I was a star seed born in the Pleiadian star system and I reincarnated down here to rise the vibe and help people shatter, dogma. I'm like, hey, I'm almost like that was not as bad. That's where they took me. We're all going to, believe some silly stuff. I mean, I don't know. So that's where, not that I'm going back there, but it's just funny how Christians then also said, how they looked at that view as so silly. And I was like, yeah, I couldn't believe I thought I was an alien, but now I'm going to believe this.
It always makes me chuckle how people are always looking at other people's religions as crazy, right? Like I remember going to a Lutheran service one time, but by a very open-minded Lutheran pastor, and he kind of took some side swipes at Mormon doctrines, which or stories and so on, and I'm like, well, that's a good point, but you say there's a talking snake, like, come on now, don't
Let's
even
be fair.
like you're Mr. Rational over here. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah. So your book reviews how people seek out. So this was really interesting for me because what I like about it is we're talking a lot about Reformed theology, but you mentioned and talked about, what was it? Vineyard
Christian Fellowship.
Yeah,
it's a neo-Pentecostal evangelical American movement that has churches in a lot of other countries now too.
Right. And that's really important to address because folks who are listening will understand the difference of the spectrum of beliefs. And, they're all rooted in evangelicalism or Protestantism for sure. So let's talk about these types of folks. So they are going to be much more likely to seek out divine healing. And I see this often in New Age and other beliefs too. This isn't just Christianity. So, whether it's supplements, whatever it's going to be, replaces medical care. Similar to how athletes, and I know that because I was a bodybuilder, I competed, we might have rituals or we might have something lucky that we bring to the race or wear a lucky pair of underwear. But that doesn't mean we're not working out really hard. That doesn't mean we're not doing our training regimen and eating appropriately. So how do these observations challenge those common perceptions about the role of religious practices in health or in other areas of life? And what implications do you think this has for understanding the dynamics between religious beliefs and practical actions in modern society?
Yeah. So maybe it's worth kind of spelling out what a lot of, I would say, philosophers and then also kind of general cultural critics of religion, how they see religious belief, right? They see it kind of like, the religious people, they just think prayer works, right? So just like I think aspirin works or ibuprofen works, they think prayer works. All right. And this notion and that's sort of in line with what I call the one map view of religious belief, where it's just like your regular beliefs about the world have a bunch of religious contents in there. And my contrasting position is what I call a two map cognitive structure, where you've got your factual beliefs, which are kind of like the same sort of thing that everyday secular people would have about the ordinary world. And then you've got a layer of religious credence superimposed on top, just like imaginings are superimposed when you're playing make-believe. Now, there is, it's not decisive evidence, but what the sort of thing that we're talking about now, how a lot of prayer and symbolic action is always supplemental to everyday practical action. I think it speaks more in favor of the two map theory than the one map theory, right? So the bodybuilder, the person who needs to get their car fixed, the person who's sick and so on, will almost never rely on this thing that they say is the all-powerful benevolent entity in the universe, but rather they'll do all the same things as we do. And when I say we, I'm just, kind of presuming a lot of listeners and so on, but that say I would do, someone who doesn't think God exists. They do all the same things as me, but then they kind of add a layer of religious gloss on top, and then they subsequently attribute the effective solution to the prayer, even though they got a surgery or took their medication or whatever. So I think it's suggestive that there really is these two maps in the mind. And what's interesting about that is it allows you to explain how, look, most religious people, they're not crazy or delusional. Their broad fabric of factual belief is largely rationally coherent and tracks what the world is like, just like anyone else's. But there's this sort of layer of sacred pretending that's superimposed on top of it, right? And I should give credit where credit's due. The ethnographies that I used in the third chapter, Religious Credence is Not Factual Belief. One is due to Tanya Luhrmann, great anthropologist who studied the vineyard for many years and wrote a book called When God Talks Back. And then another one was A Diagram for Fire by John Bialeski, who's another anthropologist who studied the vineyard. But a lot of their observations point in this direction, namely someone who's having financial troubles will tell her prayer group about it. This is from Bialeski, and they'll all kind of quietly contribute to the alleviation of her financial troubles. but then subsequently attribute it to God's answering their prayers, even though they did it themselves. Okay. So what that suggests to me is kind of like their actions are, one, practically effective and based on factual beliefs, just like if anyone was helping a friend financially, but then they're also being used as props in this religious game of make-believe, where you sign imaginary values or religiously created values to the entities and events in the ordinary world. Right. So that's the picture that emerges, I think, from considering these kind of examples. And there are a lot of independent lines of argument, and it's a convergence of evidence kind of argument. So my opponents will always say, well, that doesn't prove it. Right. But it's like, look at the large body of patterns of behavior, and it starts to snap into place, I think.
Yeah, I definitely see that quite a bit. And, I'm sure you will agree, we understand that thoughts and our mindset as an athlete, a lot of it is a mind game. And we know that. We know that. I mean, we saw that with Simone Biles, right? Mental health matters for athletes. And so we're not denying that concepts either. But I've read several studies about how what you believe about your food can impact your ghrelin response. And how, I'll share it. It's called the milkshake study. It's crazy. I'll send it over to you. It's wild. Yeah, very interesting. And so very small study, all that stuff, but still fascinating stuff to think about. Being like, okay, like I don't want to discount that there could be something going on here. And I know you wouldn't want to either. So something you mentioned earlier, which I think is the name of the game with religious credences and also conspiracy theories, which we talk a lot about on this podcast, which is like identity, group identity orienting. They really discount modern science. They discount gravity. They think the earth it's wild where they go. And, I had somebody circle back around and he was like, oh, well, you're on the right track. But if you believe in mainstream science, like I don't believe in gravity. I think we live on a dome. And I'm like, this is the same thing as like just declaring whatever you want to believe and not requiring evidence. I was like, look, I'm down to challenge stuff, but okay. So that's what I love about this conversation and where we're headed right now is that religious credences are the identity of constituting imaginative attitudes that generate symbolic actions that fold people, places, and things into secret realizing doctrines and stories. So that's kind of a complex way of saying what you were just mentioning, this overlay, this two map. And so the facts are, I live on a certain street with a certain address. And if I got that wrong, I wouldn't get home. And that is the truth. And I loved how you mentioned that. But then of course I'll have like, oh, but I almost got in an accident, but the Lord protected me. There's always could be some imaginary overlay. So religious beliefs will often shape personal and collective identities. And I see that living here in the Bible Belt, everywhere I go. How does your framework account for the intersection between belief systems and identity formation? And what I love to touch on is more like multicultural and pluralistic societies.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's maybe take conspiracy theories as a jumping off point because it helps us see a couple things clearly. So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, religious credence is the notion of an attitude or way of relating to ideas. So it's not just traditional religions that one might have an attitude of religious credence towards, right? Also could be outlandish political doctrines or outlandish conspiracy theories, right? And so what's going on there, and why do people believe in this particular way or sense so contrary to so much evidence? And kind of suggested that a little bit before, but let's dig in a little bit deeper. As you pointed out, ordinary factual beliefs, they work into guiding successful action to the extent that they're true, right? We, if we're a clever philosopher, we can think of exceptions and, blah, blah, blah. But by and large, if you want to turn on the light, you have to have a true factual belief about what the switch does. Otherwise, you turn on the garbage disposal by accident, you get that annoying grinding. We've all done that. So we see what false factual beliefs do. So factual beliefs, in light of their role, in light of the fact that they work well if they're true, they're going to generally be responsive to evidence, given the downstream instrumental behavior, like simply turning on a light switch, that they cause. However, if a certain kind of attitude is playing a role in defining or constituting a group identity, truth is not as important, right? And in fact, they might do this better if they're not true. So, for example, let's take a fanciful example. Say, Megan, you and I, let's make a religion. All right, what should we have as our guiding doctrine? Well, dogs have teeth, cats have tails, New York is in New York and clouds produce rain. It's like, okay, well, that's all true. Like, hey, we got a religion where stuff is true, or we got a group identity where we believe true things. That's not very distinctive, though, is it? We're not marking ourselves as a distinctive in-group by having evidence-based true beliefs. So the point then is kind of in light of the role that they're playing, right? And we'll say for conspiracy theorists, there's a kind of group identity there. In light of the role that they're playing, they work better if they're distinctive or they stand, kind of athwart the truth. All right. So, but in order for that to work, it has to be a different attitude type. It has to be an attitude type that is very tolerant of contrary information. Right. So one of the books that I really like and helped me see this, although I don't know if he goes quite as far as I do, is Anthony Appiah's The Lies That Bind. And he points out how all sorts of group identity narratives are riddled with falsehoods, right? About this or that being in my blood, this or that being national origins, this or that racial essence, so on and so forth. There's a lot of kind of weirdly false stuff, but it's the weirdly false stuff that makes it unique to us, right? That makes us, and I think a great or maybe like tragic or kind of nauseating example is the lost cause narrative, say, of the Civil War, right? I mean, false as can be, the Civil War was started over states' rights. I mean, give me a break. We all know it was a defense of slavery. But clinging to that narrative, it's a really sharp divider between us and them, right? And so that's why I think religious credences, have the characteristics that they do. They have to be more imaginary because they have to be distinctive. And to be distinctive, they have to not be responsive to evidence.
And I mean, we think back to, the Council of Nicaea, those, very first meetings of the bishops in early Christianity, where they stamped out a lot of sects and thoughts that were not going to be accepted by this one group of many. It was like 300 plus perhaps. And I was reading some drama that went on there. There was like a bishop who threw someone's papers down and like stepped on it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this was spicy. I wish I could like be a fly on the wall. But yeah, they definitely alienated a ton of people if you don't view the Trinity this way, if you don't view, and they were just like making stuff up about stuff that's already made up. So the whole thing is wild to me. But yeah, I really appreciate you breaking that down for us. And so we're going to dive a little bit into symbolic sacred actions, because that was some really neat stuff. And, something that I do want to touch on before we go there that I thought was a cool example that you used in some of this stuff is like when a church is in a gymnasium. And that was a really cool combination of like factual beliefs. You're in a basketball court, but you're also going to overlay that like all of a sudden you're in this sacred space, and then that also turns off. So that was kind of a really cool, easy way to see this in action, or like how how symbolic sacred action is a form of representational. Thank you, my friend. Make believe backed by imperative force of sacred values. So let's talk about, I love this example you used of like the copies of King James Bible, and that was a really funny story in the book. Or you talked about the plates under the cloth in Mormonism, or the unborn embryos in these pro-life evangelical movements, and what we see going on about certain patches of land in the Middle East. Like these are all very symbolic, sacred beliefs placed over real stuff. And so it seems like it often functions like a prop linked to these revered supernatural entities. So can you just like explain that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, well, I guess we could come at it like this. Suppose it was an imperative group value in the community that you belong to, that you engage in a certain form of make-believe play once a week, right? Well, what would that be? That would be a religion, right? I mean, that's kind of almost too direct a way of saying it, but you can see that sort of phenomenon when you look a little bit more carefully at the discrepancies between what people, proclaim as their sacred values and then the way they behave kind of when the spotlight's not on them, right? So we might call this religious hypocrisy or something like that. But to turn our attention to, say, the American pro-life movement, largely, among evangelical Christians, if you look at their patterns of political voting, they really don't support policies, aside from making it illegal, that would reduce the number of abortions. And there are lots of policies that would do the trick. We see this in Europe. So rates of abortion in places where it's incredibly accessible, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and so on, are much lower than rates of abortion in the United States. And it's not too hard to figure out what the explanation for that is. It's possible to be a single mother and still continue your education because of social safety net kind of policies. And it's like, well, if you really straightforwardly thought that these embryos were human beings, and there would be this obvious measure which would involve some raising of taxes, but not dramatically so. Like this could be done for not that much, given how much we spend on other things. So why is the pro-life movement not associated also with a pro-universal childcare movement? All right. Why is it not? Okay. And so the thing you notice is that there's this curious selectivity toward the entities and events that they are regarding as sacred. So what I'm trying to argue, this is in chapter 7 of my book, is that the religion as make-believe perspective can help explain that. So if what's really going on is, say, with pro-life demonstrations and voting patterns and putting people in the court is a sort of symbolic action where you're signaling to each other who's in your in-group and how committed you are to the in-group and how many costly things you're willing to do for the in-group, then in one sense, yes, it is about the embryos, right? Because those are your sacred props. Protecting those is a sacred thing. But insofar as there's a certain amount of conventionality to how signaling works, including group identity signaling works, then if there's a way of helping the embryos that doesn't conventionally signal your group identity, then you're not going to do it, right? You're not going to do it. So so for example, like someone getting up in church and saying, hey, these embryos are people, so we got to support universal childcare. It wouldn't be a very good signal of loyalty to that particular in-group. It might draw suspicion. It might say, hey, this is some kind of liberal. Like, who is this? Who is this person? Is she really with us? Okay. So the fact that there's kind of conventionality to the social signaling that is involved in symbolic action will mean that means to helping what you say you sacredly value, and in some sense really do, will often be left aside, right? In ways that don't obtain, like if when you factually believe that, so-and-so is your child, you do whatever you can to help them, right? And that's, if you look at least good parents, that's how it is, right? But you're not gonna, think about your own, you're not gonna, for your own kids say, oh yeah, we'll say it's illegal to murder kids, but not care about whether or not they have, decent lives otherwise.
I really appreciate how you lay that out. And that was just a conversation I was having. Someone pointed out, how do Christians talk about heaven when then they talk smack about communism? And I was like, well, that's fundamentally flawed for a lot of reasons. And yeah, that was like, but I and the thing is like some of those countries that you were mentioning, they're socialist leaning, but they have some democratic processes. They have some other aspects that it's really neat if we study their model. It really is more of a middle ground than people probably realize. And that's, I know you know that, but I find that to be exciting for me. And I'm like trying not to be super cynical about the future of our nation, because I think there's a lot of smart people here. And I'm like, come on, folks, let's do this. I promise we can. I hope. I don't know. It depends on the day.
The problem is not lack of smart people.
You're right.
Good information.
It's like breaking of dogma. It really seems like we're all stuck dead with some sort of harmful ideology, some way, shape, or form, some way.
Yeah.
Whether it's not just religion. It's like science can hold us back, or money and the dogma of like lobbyism and support. And like, I don't really know. I'm not an expert at figuring out what's going on, but yeah, I know it's not about like lack of intelligence, but I believe in our ability. That's where depends on the day, but I think it's okay to be cynical, but I'm not going to lose all hope, right? We can't.
All right. Yeah. Knock on wood.
Hey, I just wanted to pause the interview real quick to mention something fascinating that I've been reading in the book Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. In chapter 6, he talks about this concept of the master aptitude, which is hope. And I was just mentioning here in the interview that I refuse to give up all hope. It was interesting for me to read that the author here is emphasizing that hope plays a crucial role in an individual's success and well-being. And if you want to take a deeper dive, obviously go read the book. But I found this so interesting that in the research, it shows that hopeful students are more emotionally resilient, meaning they could bounce back more frequently, and that this emotional resilience was actually more insightful on their academic performance than the SAT scores. And the bottom line here is that problem solving, if you're hopeful, you're going to be a better problem solver. And we can think more creatively about how to overcome obstacles rather than feeling defeated by them. And I think that is so freaking crucial when we look around at the world today. So please check out that book, Emotional Intelligence. And we'll be breaking down another chapter about amygdala overdrive in a later interview. And please remember, it's hope that drives us to set goals, to stay motivated, and ultimately find ways to move forward, even when cynicism creeps in. For listeners interested in deconstructing or critically examining their own spiritual beliefs, what practical advice or insights can you offer based on your research and the findings in Religion as Make-Believe?
Yeah, let me start with my own personal experience, and then maybe add a little bit of my more philosophical perspective to that. So I think I stopped being Christian kind of from high school to the end of college. And what I will notice still to this day, though, is that a lot of the emotional tendencies that I acquired, right, in terms of self-criticism, right, doctrine of original sin plays a big role in Calvinist theology, as you know, and that was sort of hammered into me. And even though it is sort of a game of make believe, and you're imagining things a certain way, I guess I never thought it was really all that plausible, this doctrine of original sin. But when you rehearse it in your mind over and over again, the fact that it is a sort of sacralized game of make believe doesn't stop it from having those emotional effects on you, right? And in a way, that's the point, because in a deeper way, it's not just the narratives that we share that define our group identity, but it's also the emotional tendencies that we inculcate in ourselves through the religious make-believe practice that kind of wraps us together as an in-group. I actually get along very well with, Calvinists who are still Calvinists, right? Because there's that underlying emotional current that we have that's very similar. So I think maybe putting those two things together, I would say to people listening who are deconstructing, don't be frustrated with yourself just because the emotional tendencies don't go right away. It's like you've realized that these narratives and these religious credences and this, if my theory is right, this sacred game of make-believe is not for you. Kind of recognize from your perspective the falsity of a lot of the stories and doctrines. Poof, I'm going to be better, right? I'm going to not have those difficult emotional tendencies. Well, no, be patient with with yourself. Having those realizations is a first step, but it's definitely going to be more than that. And I think this is sort of just an interesting and maybe tragic, but also beautiful fact about humans, that the stories that we live with, as fictional and as imaginary as they are, including the religious ones, they do have deep and powerful emotional effects that won't go away overnight, especially if you spent many years. So I kind of to your audience, congratulations if you're going through deconstruction, but be patient with yourself, because, just because you've gotten your cognitive house in order doesn't mean the emotional situation is gonna clear up overnight. That's going to take work.
Yeah, I think a lot of my friends that I chat with, the feeling of having certainty ripped out from underneath you, and then feeling like you're walking on a waterbed, as Dr. Mark Karras said. I like that analogy. And then that there's this existential dread that some of my friends have, like when they're going through hardships, they were just always able to give it up to God. And I noticed that too. Something that was beaten really into me was the moment I feel really grateful for my life, I have to be really grateful to God and Jesus for it. like this guilt, be like, I'm really grateful. I was just like, had this constant Job trauma that like, I was constantly going to be like punished. Like, I would cry when I looked in the mirror about my hair and be like, oh, I like my hair too much. God's going to like make it fall out. Like, I literally was so panicked that I'd always be punished if I got too prideful. And that's what a lot of the spiritual counseling that basically teach me that it was all sin that I could repent of. And I'd be like, by believing in Jesus, it's probably the deepest, most darkest stuff. That's why we're here, my friend. So
I've got a maybe useful metaphor for thinking about some of this. So I think Christianity and a lot of other religions as well, but for me, the Christianity is the more personal one. The way it works emotionally is it's the arsonist and it's the fire brigade, right? So it's the arsonist because it makes you feel terrible for doing this or that, or liking your hair, God forbid, right? Oh, that's prideful, right? So it's it picks out all these things to make you feel bad about, and then you turn to God, right? And then God forgives you, right? So it's like the religion itself is it's the arson and it's the fire brigade. Well, maybe just skip both if you can.
Yeah. And the most, like, one of the things, like, I was in this new age, they would say, is like Satan's labyrinth. I was like always having to charge my crystals and always having to do yoga. And they're like, you found true freedom here with Jesus. But I was like, no, you just put me on another spiritual hamster wheel, insane contradictions, insane amount of cognitive dissonance. And I thought that was really unfair. Like, they sold me freedom, but it was actually absolute bondage. And so looking ahead, thank you so much for your time. And thanks everyone for listening and getting here. What are some areas within the study of religion and belief, and I threw in here that you believe need further exploration or research based on your work? Because something we didn't really touch on in the very beginning, but you kind of talked about it. There's a difference between belief and think, in a way. I mean, we talk about that. So I could have said here, based on your research, what do you think could need further exploration? But I chose to say, what do you believe? And I added a winky face. So could you kind of break that little down and then share more?
There's tons of stuff because it's a complex phenomenon. But I'll say the first one, and this is something that I'm doing some collaborative research myself on, and it comes out a little bit in the book, is just the question of the extent to which people in general, not like psychologists or philosophers, are aware of the difference between religious credence and factual belief. And it strikes me that people are at an intuitive level aware, right? So when I believe that Jesus is alive, it's different from thinking that my next door neighbor is alive, right? So I think in most people, if they're honest with themselves, at least some tacit awareness of the sort of distinction that I'm drawing at a theoretical level, right? And it comes out in vocabulary choice. People tend to use believe in relation to religious credences, think in relation to factual beliefs. I think my bicycle's in the garage. I believe that Jesus is my Lord and Savior. And insofar as that vocabulary difference is kind of intuitive, it seems to be marking an awareness of difference in attitude type. So, but then the further question becomes, well, to what extent are people aware of kind of the more details and nuances of the differences? And can they predict differences in behavior on the basis of that? So we're doing some studies right now that seem to show that there is some awareness of, so for example, people will make predictions of symbolic action versus ordinary practical action on the basis of their awareness of, is someone thinking that P or believing that P, right? So that's so people's level of what we might call theory of mind when it comes to these differences in attitude types is something really worth exploring. I think in terms of there's also a lot of interesting cross-cultural work to be done, because we don't want to generalize too much just from our own cultural case. I do make the case in the book that religious credence is a different attitude type, and it appears kind of everywhere we look throughout history and across different cultures. At the same time, there are differences. And one difference that's kind of cropped up recently is the extent to which, say, people in different cultures see there being a certain amount of antagonism between science and religion, right? So actually, it turns out in the United States, the level of people viewing antagonism between science and religion is higher than in other places, right? In other parts of the world, even though there's science and religion pretty much everywhere we go. Okay, so I think one thing that's really worth trying to dive into and to figure out is why in some cultural context does that antagonism surface more than in others? I mean, those are just kind of two streams of research that I think are worth getting into. I think I'm also collaborating with a neuroscientist now trying to figure out ways to look for neural signatures of the difference between religious creeds and factual belief. That's very hard to do. Like designing studies that can be done in an fMRI scanner, and not get spurious activation patterns. Like that's hard. So tons of interesting research to be done. And I would welcome suggestions from your audience if they want to look me up and get in touch with me.
Yeah, I thought the description about where the anthropological concepts of Daniel Dennett's book, where he's talking about where his religion come from, and the pearl concept, I thought was really neat. Like adding all these layers to where it eventually has become so unrecognizable from where it originated from. Yeah. That has got me really just thinking for days. And so thank you for recommending that book in your book. And so the last actual question I'd love to hear as we close down the interview real quick, what are some of the main challenges or any critiques that you've encountered in some of the theories you've proposed, and how do you respond to them?
Yeah, the one that kind of is more likely to crop up, I think, than others is what I call the but extremists example, right? So I've got this model of religious belief as a form of make-believe play, and people will say, well, look at all the, what the extremists do, the terrorists and so on and so forth. Surely they must factually believe their religious stories and doctrines. One thing I could say to that is, yeah, maybe they do, but they're different from most people. But that's actually not what I think is true, right? I think what they have is a form of sacralized make-believe play that is due to group dynamics much more violent than you see among most of other people in the world. Right. So the fact that something is a form of sacred signaling doesn't mean that it's not dramatic or extreme or violent. It very well could be. And one of the things to look for is, well, what do violent extremists do when they're not on the job, right? When they're not training to be a terrorist or actually doing terrorist actions? Well, very often they engage in smoking and drinking and womanizing as much as anyone, right? And so if you look at the overall pattern of behavior, you see something very similar to ordinary religious people who are, once a week religionists and not so much otherwise. You see the same sort of thing. It's just the sacred action itself is far more extreme and violent. So I think that fits better. So this is my response to the objection. That fits better with the religion as make-believe model than with they just think there was a talking snake in the Garden of Eden, right? Or they just think they're going to get 72 virgins, right? No, it's about sacred value and group identity. That's what's driving the extreme violence. And then the form that the actions take, sure, those are guided by the religious credences and sacred narratives. But that is not the same thing as just having a simple one map cognitive structure. Anyway, so that's probably the main objection that I've had to deal with. And I think it's worth thinking about, but I think I can handle it.
I agree. And yeah, I think that this dualism that comes from religion, but look at all the good it's done. I'm like, isn't that wild that something can be on the forefront of, abolishing slavery, but then also look at all the atrocities, centuries of mind blowing. So I think that your theory definitely helps kind of break down that dualism that we see. And that is also, how we can challenge the challenge. So thanks you so much for all your expertise in writing this book. I'm really excited to follow your career and what more you're working on. What's the best way for us to stay in touch with what you're up to, what you're publishing? Do you blog? Do you share any of the stuff for any of us?
Yeah, I've stepped away from blogging a little bit, but if someone would love to read my book, it's on Amazon. It's at the website for Harvard University Press. So if you just Google religion as make believe, you'll find it quick enough. So that's maybe I would love it if people started with that. My papers are pretty easy to find, so I post all my papers on this website called philpapers, philpapers.org, and that's a good way to find my collected writings and essays and stuff like that. They're published in various places, but that's where I post all my preprints, and that's basically the same thing as content-wise as the publications. If people want to email me, if you Google me, you can find my email easily enough, and I love hearing from people.
Awesome. Well, I will link all that in the show notes just to help. And I really want to encourage them to get in touch with you and share their thoughts and insights. And thank you so much for your time today. And thanks everyone for listening. That's all I have for you today, folks. Next week, we've got my friend Carrie Moore coming on to talk about Franciscan theology. She's going to be talking more about navigating spiritual growth and challenges. And then we have some other really great interviews coming up. I cannot wait. Thanks again for tuning in for season 2. If you've not yet left a 5-star review, leave your girl some love. This is such a tiny podcast, or you know what? You don't have to leave me a review, but send it to a friend or send me a DM. Let me know what you think. I would love to hear from you. Until then, maintain your curiosity, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.